The twisted wreckage of an F-35 Lightning II fighter jet shouldn't have been able to fly, let alone execute a precision rescue mission over hostile territory. With hydraulics failing, engines sputtering, and half the avionics systems dead, aircraft was more scrap metal than fighting machine. But Lieutenant Catherine Kate Morrison wasn't thinking about aerodynamics or engineering impossibilities as she wrestled the dying aircraft through enemy airspace. 23 American soldiers were trapped in a convoy below, surrounded by hostile forces, and she was their only hope for survival. What those soldiers didn't know was that the pilot desperately trying to save them had been written off as a failure by almost everyone in the military aviation community. They called her Crash Course Kate, a cruel nickname that followed her through flight school, mocking her unconventional flying style and the series of training incidents that had nearly ended her career before it started. But nicknames can be deceiving, and Kate Morrison was about to prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are forged in the crucible of adversity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert heat shimmered off the tarmac at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, creating a liquid mirage that distorted the rows of fighter jets parked along the flight line. The morning sun had already pushed temperatures past 90 degrees, and it wasn't even 8 o'clock yet. For the 36 pilots selected for the Elite Fighter Weapons School, the most prestigious advanced training program in the Air Force, this would be their home for the next 4 months. Only 12 would graduate with the coveted fighter weapons instructor designation. The rest would return to their regular squadrons, their dreams of joining the aerial elite forever grounded. Lieutenant Catherine Morrison adjusted her flight suit and shouldered her gear bag, trying to project confidence she didn't entirely feel. At 25, she was younger than most of her classmates, and she knew that youth wouldn't work in her favor here. The Fighter Weapons School didn't accept students based on potential or promise. Every pilot walking across this tarmac had already proven themselves exceptional. They were squadron leaders, combat veterans, the best of the best from bases around the world. Kate had earned her spot through a combination of outstanding test scores and what her commanding officer diplomatically called innovative flight techniques. Others had less charitable descriptions for her flying style. The nickname had started during her first week at pilot training 3 years earlier. While other students methodically followed procedures and flew by the book, Kate had a tendency to find creative solutions to problems that sometimes bordered on improvisation. During a simulated emergency landing exercise, she'd successfully brought down a trainer aircraft with a stuck landing gear by using an unorthodox approach angle that violated standard protocols but prevented a crash. Her instructor had been torn between writing her up for procedure violations and recommending her for exceptional piloting skills. The other students had dubbed her Crash Course Kate, initially as a joke about her willingness to take risks others wouldn't consider. But jokes have a way of becoming labels, and labels have a way of defining reputations. By the time Kate graduated from flight training and moved on to F-35 Lightning II qualification, the nickname had followed her. Instructors would introduce her to new squadrons with comments like, "This is Lieutenant Morrison, we call her Crash Course Kate because she's always finding the hard way to learn things." What started as harmless ribbing gradually morphed into something more problematic. When equipment malfunctioned during training flights, Kate's name was often the first mentioned in post-flight debriefings. When unconventional maneuvers were discussed, instructors would reference pulling a Crash Course Kate as shorthand for reckless flying. The irony wasn't lost on Kate that her actual crash record was spotless. In 3 years of flying everything from basic trainers to advanced fighter jets, she'd never damaged an aircraft or failed to complete a mission. But perception often matters more than reality in military aviation. where confidence and precision are valued above creativity and adaptability. Her fellow pilots respected her technical skills, but questioned her judgment. Squadron commanders appreciated her problem-solving abilities, but worried about her tendency to deviate from established procedures. As Kate walked toward the fighter weapons school briefing hangar, she noticed the subtle ways her reputation preceded her. Conversations quieted when she approached groups of pilots. Officers who'd heard stories about Crash Course Kate studied her with curious expressions, as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of them with the legend of the unconventional pilot. Some looked intrigued, others skeptical, and a few seemed openly dismissive. The briefing hangar was a monument to American airpower, its walls covered with photographs of legendary pilots and historic aircraft. Squadron patches from every major air campaign since World War II created a colorful mosaic of military aviation history. The room could hold 200 people, but today only 36 pilots filled the front rows, along with a dozen instructors and support staff. The atmosphere was electric with nervous energy and barely contained competitive tension. Colonel James Hartwell stepped to the podium with the confident bearing of a man who'd flown combat missions over 3 different continents. His uniform displayed ribbons that read like a catalog of modern air warfare: Operation Desert Storm, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom. The distinguished flying cross on his chest caught the overhead lights as he surveyed the assembled pilots with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating potential prey. "Welcome to the Fighter Weapons School," Hartwell began, his voice carrying easily through the hangar without amplification. "You're here because someone, somewhere, believed you had the potential to become not just good pilots, but exceptional ones. That someone may have been wrong." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, but Hartwell's expression remained stone serious. "This program has a 70% failure rate. That means 25 of you will not graduate. You'll return to your home squadrons with the knowledge that when it mattered most, when you had the opportunity to join the elite, you weren't good enough." Kate felt the familiar tightness in her stomach that came with high-stakes situations. She'd been through competitive selection processes before, but nothing quite like this. The Fighter Weapons School wasn't just about flying skills. It was about tactical thinking, leadership under pressure, and the ability to teach advanced combat techniques to other pilots. Graduates became the go-to experts in their squadrons, the pilots other pilots looked to when situations got complicated. "Your instructors are all combat veterans," Hartwell continued, gesturing toward the men and women in flight suits standing along the walls. "They've flown missions in environments where mistakes mean death, not just failed grades. They've seen what separates competent pilots from exceptional ones, and they'll push you harder than you've ever been pushed before." His eyes swept across the assembled students, lingering momentarily on Kate before moving on. "Some of you may be wondering what makes this program different from the training you've already completed. The answer is simple. Here, we don't just teach you to fly fighter jets. We teach you to think like weapons." The briefing continued with administrative details, safety protocols, and academic requirements. Kate took notes mechanically while part of her mind wandered to the F-35 Lightning E's parked outside. The Joint Strike Fighter was the most advanced combat aircraft ever built, a technological marvel that represented the cutting edge of military aviation. Every system was computer-controlled, every component designed for maximum efficiency and combat effectiveness. Flying an F-35 was like conducting a symphony orchestra, where every instrument was a weapon system. But Kate had learned during her previous F-35 training that all the technology in the world couldn't replace pilot instinct and adaptability. Computer systems failed, sensors malfunctioned, and weapon systems jammed at the worst possible moments. When technology failed, pilots had to rely on skill, experience, and the kind of creative problem-solving that couldn't be programmed into any computer. It was exactly the kind of flying that had earned her the Crash Course Kate nickname, and exactly the kind of thinking that conventional military aviation often discouraged. After the briefing, pilots were divided into four-person flight groups for initial aircraft assignments. Kate found herself paired with three pilots whose reputations preceded them in ways that made her own nickname seem almost quaint. Captain Derek Sullivan was known throughout the Air Force as Perfect Storm Sullivan, a pilot whose precision and attention to detail had become legendary. He'd never received a grade below 98% on any evaluation, never missed a target by more than inches, and never deviated from approved procedures. Where Kate was known for improvisation, Sullivan was famous for flawless execution of established techniques. Major Lisa Chun had earned the call sign Calculator during her first combat deployment, where her ability to instantly compute complex targeting solutions had saved multiple ground units from friendly fire incidents. She could process trajectory calculations, wind speed adjustments, and target movement predictions faster than most pilots could operate their computers. Her analytical mind and mathematical precision made her the opposite of Kate's intuitive flying style. The fourth member of their group was Captain Robert Hayes, whose call sign Textbook perfectly captured his approach to military aviation. Hayes had memorized every regulation, procedure, and technical manual relevant to fighter pilot operations. He could quote aircraft specifications from memory, recite emergency procedures without hesitation, and identify system malfunctions based solely on instrument readings. Where Kate tended to feel her way through problems, Hayes relied on established knowledge and proven procedures as the four pilots walked toward their assigned aircraft. Kate couldn't help but notice the irony of the pairing. She'd been grouped with three of the most conventional, by-the-book pilots in the program. Whether this was coincidence or deliberate assignment designed to highlight her differences, she couldn't tell. But she suspected that her next 4 months would involve constant comparison between her unorthodox methods and their proven approaches. The F-35, Lightning II designated as their primary training aircraft, was a magnificent piece of engineering. 45 feet long with a wingspan of 35 feet, it represented billions of dollars in research and development. The aircraft's stealth coating gave it an almost otherworldly appearance, absorbing radar waves and making it nearly invisible to enemy detection systems. Kate ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the slight texture of the radar-absorbing material beneath her fingers. "Beautiful machine," Sullivan commented, his voice carrying the reverence of a pilot who truly understood the technology before them. Pratt & Whitney F-135 engine producing 43,000 pounds of thrust. Top speed Mach 1.6, combat radius of 670 nautical miles. $600 million of the most advanced fighter technology ever created. The avionics suite includes an APG-81A ESA radar, an ASQ-239 electronic warfare system, and an AAQ-37 distributed aperture system. Hayes added, his encyclopedic knowledge of technical specifications on full display. The aircraft can simultaneously track and engage multiple air and ground targets while maintaining stealth characteristics. Chun nodded appreciatively while studying the weapons pylons and sensor arrays. The targeting computer can process over 1 million calculations per second. Fire control systems are integrated with helmet-mounted displays for precision weapons delivery. It's like flying a computer with wings. Kate listened to their technical discussion while her own thoughts took a different direction. All the specifications and capabilities in the world meant nothing if the pilot couldn't adapt when systems failed or situations changed. She'd learned during her F-35 training that the aircraft's greatest strength, its reliance on computer systems, could also become its greatest weakness when those systems encountered problems they weren't programmed to handle. The more advanced the technology, the more ways it could fail, and the more important it became for pilots to think beyond their training manuals, Their first instructor appeared as they completed their initial aircraft inspection. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell was a compact woman in her late 30s whose confident stride and sharp eyes immediately commanded respect. Her flight suit bore patches indicating combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, along with the distinctive Fighter Weapons School instructor badge that marked her as one of the elite. She carried herself with the easy confidence of someone who'd proven herself in environments where second place meant death. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, and I'll be your primary flight instructor for the next 4 months, she announced without preamble. I've reviewed all your files, and I have to say, this is one of the most interesting groups I've been assigned. In 5 years of teaching here, her gaze moved from pilot to pilot, lingering slightly longer on Kate. Sullivan, your precision flying is textbook perfect. Chun, your analytical skills are exceptional. Hayes, your technical knowledge is encyclopedic. And Morrison ... She paused, and Kate felt her stomach tighten. You have a reputation for creative problem-solving that either makes you a genius or a disaster waiting to happen. We're here to find out which. The assessment was blunt but not unfair. Kate had heard similar evaluations throughout her career, and she'd learned that her unconventional approach to flying either impressed people or worried them, with very little middle ground. The challenge would be proving that innovation and adaptation were assets rather than liabilities in the high-stakes world of advanced fighter operations. Your first training flight will be basic aircraft familiarization, Mitchell continued, but don't let the word basic fool you. Will be evaluating your situational awareness, communication skills, and ability to operate as part of a coordinated team. The F-35 is designed for network operations, which means your individual skills matter less than your ability to integrate with other aircraft and ground systems. As they began their pre-flight briefing, Kate realized that her reputation would be both a challenge and an opportunity over the coming months. The Crash Course Kate nickname carried baggage, but it also set expectations that she might be able to exceed. If she could prove that her unconventional methods were actually strengths rather than weaknesses, she might finally earn the respect that had eluded her throughout her career. But first, she had to survive a program designed to eliminate 3/4 of its students, taught by instructors who valued conformity and precision above creativity and adaptation. The morning sun climbed higher over the Nevada desert, and Kate Morrison prepared for the fight of her professional life, unaware that the skills she'd spent years defending would soon save 23 lives in a way no one could have predicted. First training flight should have been straightforward. Basic formation flying, communication protocols, and aircraft familiarization over the relatively safe airspace surrounding Nellis. But for Kate Morrison, even routine exercises had a way of becoming complicated in ways that reinforced her unwanted reputation. The trouble started during the pre-flight inspection when Kate noticed a slight hydraulic fluid leak near the landing gear assembly of her assigned F-35. The stain was barely visible, perhaps a few drops that most pilots would have overlooked or dismissed as normal aircraft weeping. Kate called it out to the maintenance crew, expecting a quick check and clearance to fly. Instead, the inspection revealed a hairline crack in a hydraulic line that could have led to landing gear failure during flight operations. Good catch, Morrison, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell acknowledged during the post-flight briefing. That kind of attention to detail can save lives. But Kate could see the expressions on her fellow pilots' faces. To them, it looked like she was already living up to her nickname, finding problems where others saw none. Sullivan's comment after the briefing captured the general sentiment. Leave it to Crash Course Kate to ground an aircraft before we even take off. The incident set a pattern that would define Kate's first month at the Fighter Weapons School. While other pilots focused on demonstrating their flying skills, Kate seemed to attract equipment malfunctions, weather complications, and technical problems that turned routine training flights into lessons in crisis management. During a navigation exercise over the desert, her GPS system experienced intermittent failures that forced her to rely on dead reckoning and visual landmarks. Her successful completion of the mission using backup navigation methods impressed the instructors but earned eye rolls from classmates, who saw it as another example of Kate's tendency to complicate simple tasks. The most damaging incident occurred during the third week, when Kate's flight group was practicing air-to-air combat maneuvers against instructor pilots playing the role of enemy aircraft. The exercise called for precise coordination between the 4 student pilots, with each aircraft assigned specific roles in a complex tactical scenario. Kate was designated as wingman to Captain Sullivan, responsible for maintaining formation and following his lead during engagement sequences. Everything went wrong when Sullivan's aircraft developed a radio malfunction that prevented clear communication between the 2 jets. Standard procedure called for aborting the exercise and returning to base when communication was compromised. But Kate could see through her canopy that Sullivan was continuing the mission, apparently unaware that his radio transmissions weren't getting through. The instructor playing the enemy pilot was maneuvering for what would have been a simulated missile lock on Sullivan's aircraft, a scenario that would result in a training failure for the entire flight. Kate made a split-second decision that would haunt her for weeks. Instead of breaking off and returning to base as procedures dictated, she maneuvered her F-35 to block the instructor's simulated attack, using her aircraft as a shield while frantically trying to signal Sullivan through hand gestures and aircraft positioning. The maneuver worked tactically. Sullivan avoided the simulated missile lock and successfully completed his attack run. But it violated multiple safety protocols and communication procedures. The post-flight debriefing was brutal. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's calm professionalism couldn't entirely mask her concern about Kate's decision-making under pressure. "Morrison, your tactical thinking was sound, but your execution violated established safety protocols," she said, in front of the entire flight group. In a training environment, safety takes precedence over mission success. What happens if your unauthorized maneuver had resulted in a mid-air collision? Kate tried to explain her reasoning, that Sullivan's aircraft was in immediate danger and that standard abort procedures would have taken too long to implement safely. But her explanation sounded like excuses to ears that were already predisposed to see her as a pilot who took unnecessary risks. Captain Hayes later commented to other students that "crash course Kate strikes again," and the phrase became a running joke throughout the squadron. The psychological pressure was more challenging than the flying itself. Kate found herself increasingly isolated during mealtimes and social gatherings. Conversations would pause when she approached, then resume in hushed tones after she passed. Study groups formed without her, leaving her to prepare for academic exams and tactical briefings alone. When equipment assignments were made, she consistently received the aircraft with the most maintenance issues or the oldest avionics systems. The isolation strategy seemed coordinated, though Kate couldn't prove it. Major Chun, who had initially been friendly and professional, became increasingly distant after the radio communication incident. Captain Hayes made a point of discussing proper procedures loudly whenever Kate was within earshot, as if giving impromptu lectures on the importance of following established protocols. Even Captain Sullivan, whose aircraft Kate had potentially saved during the training exercise, seemed uncomfortable around her. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's teaching style added another layer of pressure. During classroom sessions on advanced tactics and weapon systems, she would single out Kate with hypothetical scenarios designed to test decision-making under extreme pressure. "Morrison, you're flying solo over enemy territory when your primary weapons system fails and your communications are jammed. You have 3 enemy aircraft converging on your position and a damaged engine. Walk me through your response in real time." The scenarios were always more complex and time-pressured than those given to other students. While Sullivan might be asked to calculate optimal intercept courses under ideal conditions, Kate would be presented with problems involving multiple system failures, communication breakdowns, and split-second tactical decisions. She consistently found solutions, often creative ones that impressed the instructors, but the constant pressure reinforced the perception that she was a pilot who attracted complicated situations that the academic component of the fighter weapons. School proved equally challenging, not because of the material itself, but because of the way Kate's contributions were received by her classmates. During tactical planning exercises, her suggestions for alternative approaches or contingency plans were often dismissed as unnecessarily complex. When she proposed using unconventional flight paths to avoid enemy radar coverage, other students would point out that standard routes had proven effective in previous conflicts. Her emphasis on preparing for equipment failures and communication breakdowns was seen as pessimistic rather than prudent. The turning point came during a particularly difficult simulation exercise in the fourth week. The scenario involved a complex air-to-ground mission where student pilots had to coordinate strikes against multiple targets while defending against simulated surface-to-air missiles and enemy fighter aircraft. Each pilot was assigned specific targets and given detailed briefing materials outlining the approved attack routes and timing sequences. Kate spent hours studying the mission parameters and identified several potential problems with the planned approach. The designated flight paths would take the aircraft directly over known anti-aircraft positions, and the timing sequence didn't account for potential delays caused by weather or equipment malfunctions. She prepared alternative routes and backup timing options, presenting them to her flight group during the pre-mission briefing. "The standard approach assumes everything goes perfectly," Kate explained, pointing to the tactical display. "But if we encounter unexpected resistance here, or if weather delays our approach by even 2 minutes, the entire mission timeline falls apart. I've worked out 3 contingency plans that would allow us to adapt without compromising mission success." Captain Sullivan examined her proposals with the meticulous attention to detail that had earned him his reputation for precision. "These alternatives are tactically sound," he admitted, "but they deviate significantly from the approved mission plan. The instructors are evaluating our ability to execute established procedures, not our creativity in developing new ones." Major Chun agreed, her analytical mind focusing on the evaluation criteria rather than tactical effectiveness. "The simulation is designed to test our proficiency with standard NATO engagement protocols. Using unauthorized approaches, even effective ones, could result in automatic failure." Captain Hayes was more direct in his criticism. "This is exactly what I'm talking about with Crash Course Kate," he said, his voice carrying the exasperation of someone who'd reached the end of his patience. "Every exercise becomes an opportunity to reinvent proven tactics. Sometimes the standard approach is standard because it works." Kate felt the familiar frustration of being right for the wrong reasons. Her alternative plans were tactically superior, and part of her knew that real combat situations would require exactly the kind of adaptability she was proposing. But the fighter weapons school was as much about conformity as capability, and her continued insistence on preparing for the unexpected was marking her as a pilot who couldn't be trusted to follow orders. The simulation itself proved Kate's concerns. Justified, though not in a way that vindicated her approach. 2 of the 4 student aircraft encountered simulated equipment failures that forced them to deviate from the planned flight path. The mission timeline collapsed exactly as Kate had predicted, and the entire flight group received failing grades for their inability to adapt to changing circumstances. But instead of recognizing the value of Kate's contingency planning, the debrief focused on the importance of maintaining formation discipline and following established procedures even when conditions changed. In real combat, you don't have the Luxury of redesigning missions on the fly, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell explained to the failed flight group. Success depends on every pilot knowing their role and executing it precisely, even when circumstances become difficult. Individual creativity can compromise unit effectiveness if it disrupts coordinated operations. Kate sat in the back of the briefing room, feeling the weight of missed opportunity. She'd identified the problems, developed solutions, and watched her predictions come true, but none of it mattered because she'd been asking the wrong questions. The fighter weapons school wasn't looking for pilots who could think outside the box. It was looking for pilots who could execute inside the box with absolute precision. That evening, Kate found a handwritten note slipped under her dormitory door. The message was unsigned and written in block letters. Some people aren't cut out for elite units. Save yourself the embarrassment and request transfer before you wash out publicly. The note wasn't threatening, but it carried the unmistakable message that someone wanted her gone badly enough to risk putting their opinion in writing. Kate stared at the paper for a long time, then carefully folded it and placed it in her desk drawer next to her father's old flight log. She'd been carrying that log since pilot training, though she'd never mentioned it to anyone. The worn leather cover bore the faded gold wings of a Navy pilot, and the pages inside documented flights from aircraft carriers in the Pacific during conflicts that were still classified. Her father had never talked much about his military service, but Kate had found the log among his personal effects after his death and kept it as a reminder of the family tradition she was trying to continue, what her classmates didn't know, what the instructors hadn't discovered, and what even the administrative records didn't reflect was that Catherine Morrison came from a family of aviators whose service records told a very different story about the value of unconventional thinking. In aerial combat, her father had been more than just a Navy pilot, and her grandfather had been more than just a flight instructor. The Morrison family had a legacy of succeeding in impossible situations through exactly the kind of adaptability and creative problem-solving that the fighter weapons school seemed determined to eliminate, but that legacy was a secret Kate had been instructed to keep. And as she prepared for another day of systematic undermining by instructors and classmates who saw her as a liability rather than an asset, she wondered if the time had come to reveal the truth about who she really was and what she'd been trained to do. The desert wind rattled her dormitory window as Kate Morrison fell asleep, unaware that tomorrow would bring new challenges designed to break her spirit, and that within weeks she would face a situation where all her unconventional skills would be the only thing standing between 23 American soldiers and certain death. The 8th week of the fighter weapons school brought an announcement that changed everything. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell stood before the assembled students in the main briefing theater, her expression more serious than usual as she outlined what would become the program's defining challenge. Behind her, a large screen displayed satellite imagery of a remote training facility in the mountains of Colorado, where realistic urban combat scenarios were conducted using live ammunition and actual military threats. Next week, you'll participate in Operation Iron Eagle, Mitchell announced, her voice carrying the weight of finality. This is your comprehensive evaluation exercise, a 5-day joint training mission with Army Special Forces Navy SEALs and Marine Recon units. You'll be providing close air support for ground operations in a fully realistic combat environment. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Iron Eagle was legendary among military aviators, a training exercise so demanding that it had ended careers and broken pilots who couldn't handle the pressure. Unlike the controlled simulations they'd been running, this would involve real explosives, live ammunition, and consequences that extended far beyond failed grades. The ground units they'd be supporting were elite special operations teams whose lives would depend on the precision and reliability of air support. Mission assignments will be based on your performance to date, Mitchell continued, and Kate felt her stomach drop. Top performers will lead primary attack missions. Others will provide secondary support or reconnaissance. The unspoken message was clear. Kate's reputation for complications and unconventional methods had likely earned her the least critical assignments. If she was included in the main operations at all. After the briefing, Kate found herself walking alone across the base toward the flight line, needing time to process what she'd heard. The other students had clustered into their usual groups, discussing mission possibilities and strategizing for the selection process. No one had invited her to join their conversations, and she'd stopped expecting invitations weeks ago. The isolation had become so complete that she sometimes felt like a ghost haunting the edges of the program. The maintenance hangar was nearly empty in the late afternoon, most of the crew having finished their shifts hours earlier. Kate often came here when she needed to think, finding comfort in the familiar sounds and smells of aircraft maintenance. The F-35s lined up in perfect rows represented the pinnacle of military aviation technology, but surrounded by tools and spare parts. They looked more like complex puzzles waiting to be solved. She was examining the engine assembly of her regularly assigned aircraft when she noticed something that made her pause. Hidden behind a panel that should have been properly secured, she found a maintenance log that had been forgotten or deliberately concealed. The entries documented a pattern of recurring problems with this particular aircraft: hydraulic fluctuations, intermittent avionics failures, and engine performance. Irregularities that had been resolved through temporary fixes rather than proper repairs. The discovery triggered a flood of memories from the past 8 weeks. The hydraulic leak she'd found during her first flight hadn't been a random equipment failure. It had been a known issue that maintenance crews had been monitoring for weeks. The GPS malfunctions during navigation exercises hadn't been isolated incidents. They'd been recurring problems that occurred predictably under certain atmospheric conditions. Even the radio failure during the formation exercise had been documented in previous maintenance reports as an intermittent fault that affected specific aircraft configurations. Kate sat on a tool crate in the empty hangar, holding the concealed maintenance log and processing the implications of what she'd discovered. Her classmates and instructors hadn't just been dismissive of her unconventional methods. They'd been actively sabotaging her training by ensuring she faced technical challenges that other students avoided. The crash course Kate reputation hadn't been earned through her own mistakes or poor decision-making. It had been manufactured through deliberate assignment of problematic aircraft in situations designed to make her fail. The realization was simultaneously liberating and infuriating. For months, she'd been questioning her own abilities and wondering if the criticism was justified. She'd started second-guessing her instincts and trying to conform to expectations that seemed impossible to meet. But the hidden maintenance log proved that her technical problems had been real, her solutions had been necessary, and her reputation for complications had been at least partially orchestrated by people who wanted her to fail. But understanding the conspiracy didn't solve her immediate problem. Operation Iron Eagle was days away, and her performance rating would determine her role in the exercise. She could report the maintenance irregularities and demand a formal investigation, but that would take weeks to resolve and might not change the mission assignments that had already been made. She could confront Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell or the other instructors, but without proof of deliberate sabotage, her accusations would sound like the desperate excuses of a failing student. Kate made a decision that would define the rest of her career. Instead of fighting the system that had been working against her, she would use the next few days to demonstrate capabilities that no amount of sabotage could undermine. She would stop trying to prove that she could conform to their expectations and start proving that their expectations were inadequate for the challenges real combat would present. That evening, Kate returned to her dormitory and opened her father's flight log for the first time since arriving at the fighter weapons school. She'd been carrying it as a reminder of family tradition, but she'd never actually studied the detailed mission entries and tactical notes that filled its pages. What she found changed her understanding of everything she thought she knew about military aviation and her own family history. The log documented operations that had never appeared in any official military records she'd seen. Her father hadn't just been a Navy carrier pilot. He'd been part of a classified special operations unit that conducted missions requiring exactly the kind of unconventional thinking and adaptability that the fighter weapons school seemed determined to eliminate. The entries described situations where standard procedures had failed, where creative problem-solving had saved lives, and where pilots who could think outside established parameters had succeeded where conventional approaches had failed. More importantly, the log contained detailed notes about techniques that weren't taught in any standard flight manual. Methods for maximizing aircraft performance when systems were compromised. Tactics for operating in electronic warfare environments where computers and navigation systems became unreliable. Approaches to close air support that prioritized ground unit survival over procedural compliance. Kate realized that she'd been unconsciously applying principles her father had developed through combat experience, techniques that had been passed down through informal training rather than official doctrine. Hidden in the back pages of the log, Kate found something that changed everything. Detailed schematics and performance, data for prototype modifications that had never been officially approved or documented. Her father and his unit had been testing experimental approaches to fighter aircraft employment, developing capabilities that existed outside normal operational parameters. The technical drawings showed weapon system configurations, avionics modifications, and flight envelope expansions that could transform a standard F-35 into something far more capable than factory specifications indicated. Kate spent the next 3 days studying her father's notes and translating his combat-tested modifications into approaches she could apply with standard aircraft and equipment. She couldn't implement the physical modifications he documented, but she could adapt his tactical principles and technical insights to her own flying. More importantly, she could prepare for Operation Iron Eagle with a level of knowledge and capability that her instructors and classmates couldn't imagine. The night before mission assignments were announced, Kate received another anonymous note, this one more direct than the previous message. Last chance to save face. Request medical leave or family emergency. Don't humiliate yourself during Iron Eagle. But Kate no longer felt the uncertainty and self-doubt that had plagued her for weeks. She'd found evidence of the conspiracy working against her, discovered the true extent of her family's military legacy, and developed plans for proving her worth in ways that couldn't be sabotaged or dismissed. She wrote a response note and left it where the anonymous messenger would find it. Thank you for the motivation. See you at Iron Eagle. The mission briefing the next morning confirmed Kate's worst expectations. She'd been assigned to reconnaissance and backup support duties, flying solo missions to gather intelligence for the primary attack units. It was the kind of assignment given to pilots who couldn't be trusted with critical responsibilities, designed to keep her out of the way while the real pilots handled important tasks. Captain Sullivan would lead the primary close air support mission. Major Chun would coordinate multi-target engagement sequences. Captain Hayes would manage tactical communications and electronic warfare support. But Kate had spent 3 days preparing for exactly this scenario. Her father's log had included extensive notes about the value of reconnaissance missions and how solo operations could provide opportunities unavailable to pilots operating in formation. She'd studied the Colorado training facility using satellite imagery and topographical maps, identifying alternative approach routes and contingency positions that weren't included in the standard briefing materials. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell delivered the assignment with an expression that suggested sympathy rather than malice. Morrison, you'll be flying solo reconnaissance over the northern sector. Gather intelligence on ground unit positions and relay information to the primary attack teams. Stay clear of the main combat areas and maintain communication protocols at all times. Kate accepted the assignment without complaint, but privately she was already planning modifications that would transform her reconnaissance mission into something far more significant. Her father's notes had taught her that the most important battles were often won by pilots who weren't supposed to be heroes, and that the greatest opportunities for impact came from situations where expectations were lowest as the other students began their detailed mission planning and coordination sessions. Kate prepared for Iron Eagle with a level of strategic thinking that her previous training hadn't equipped her with. She'd been given the least prestigious assignment in the exercise, but she intended to prove that reconnaissance missions could be as crucial as direct combat operations. What none of them knew was that Kate Morrison had stopped trying to meet their expectations and started preparing to exceed them in ways they couldn't predict. The hidden maintenance log had shown her that the game was rigged, but her father's flight log had taught her how to win despite the odds. Operation Iron Eagle would be her opportunity to demonstrate that Crash Course Kate had been underestimated by people who didn't understand what real combat capability looked like. The transport flights to Colorado would depart in 48 hours, and Kate Morrison was ready to prove that sometimes the most dangerous pilot in the sky is the one nobody takes seriously. She had plans that extended far beyond her assigned reconnaissance duties, capabilities that weren't documented in any official training records, and a family legacy that was about to transform her from the program's biggest liability into its most valuable asset. But first, she had to survive an exercise designed to test the limits of elite military aviators, where real ammunition and actual consequences would determine who belonged among the best pilots in the world. Kate Morrison was about to discover that her unconventional methods weren't weaknesses to be overcome. They were weapons to be unleashed. The Colorado Rockies rose like jagged teeth against the dawn sky as six F-35 Lightning A's streaked through the mountain valleys toward their designated operational areas. The thin air at 12,000 feet altitude made the engines work harder, but the reduced atmospheric density also allowed the aircraft to achieve higher speeds with greater fuel efficiency. Kate Morrison flew alone, her reconnaissance mission keeping her separated from the formation of 5 other jets heading toward the main combat zones. Operation Iron Eagle had begun at 0600 hours with a complexity that dwarfed anything the fighter weapons school students had previously experienced. Below them, spread across 30 square miles of rugged terrain, special operations teams from 4 different military branches were conducting coordinated ground operations against simulated enemy positions. The exercise involved real explosives, live ammunition for defensive purposes, and consequences that would follow the participants for the rest of their careers. Kate's assigned sector covered the northern approach routes where intelligence suggested enemy reinforcements might attempt to infiltrate the main combat area. Her mission parameters were straightforward: maintain altitude, observe through advanced sensor systems, and report any unusual activity to the command center coordinating the overall operation. It was exactly the kind of safe, peripheral assignment given to pilots whose capabilities were questioned. But Kate had spent the previous 48 hours studying terrain maps and satellite imagery with an intensity that went far beyond her official responsibilities. She'd identified 17 potential enemy positions that weren't included in the standard intelligence briefings, calculated optimal sensor deployment angles for maximum coverage, and developed contingency plans for situations that exceeded her reconnaissance mandate. Most importantly, she'd programmed her aircraft systems with modifications based on her father's experimental techniques, subtle adjustments that enhanced sensor performance and expanded her operational capabilities. The first indication that Operation Iron Eagle would be more challenging than anticipated came 30 minutes into the exercise. Kate was conducting systematic sweeps of her ridgeline, designated as low-priority surveillance, when her thermal imaging sensors detected movement in a canyon that intelligence reports had classified as impassable terrain. Multiple heat signatures were moving in coordinated patterns, suggesting a well-organized unit rather than the scattered individual infiltrators her briefing had described. Kate switched to high-resolution optical sensors and confirmed what the thermal imagery had suggested: a full company of opposing force personnel, approximately 40 individuals, were conducting an elaborate flanking maneuver through terrain that official maps showed as too difficult for large unit movement. They were carrying heavy weapons and communications equipment, clearly planning an assault on the main combat area from an unexpected direction. Standard procedure required Kate to report her findings to the operations center and maintain her assigned patrol pattern. But her father's flight log had taught her that reconnaissance pilots who simply observed and reported often missed opportunities to prevent disasters rather than just document them. The opposing force unit was moving toward positions where they could attack American ground teams from behind, potentially causing casualties that would haunt the exercise participants for years. Kate made her first major decision of the exercise. Instead of immediately reporting the contact, she maneuvered her F-35 to gather additional intelligence on the enemy unit's capabilities and intentions. Using sensor techniques her father had developed for classified operations, she conducted detailed surveillance that revealed the full scope of the threat. The opposing force wasn't just planning a flanking attack. They were preparing to simulate a coordinated assault using multiple weapon systems that could overwhelm the American ground units. The intelligence she gathered painted a picture that differed dramatically from pre-exercise briefings. The opposing force commander had anticipated the American tactical approach and positioned his units to exploit weaknesses in the planned defensive arrangements. The main combat teams were walking into an ambush that would result in simulated casualties and mission failure for most of the participating units. Kate faced a choice that would define her entire military career. She could report her findings through official channels and hope that command would modify the mission in time to prevent disaster. Or she could take action that exceeded her authority, but might save the exercise for the American forces. Her father's notes had emphasized that the most critical moments in combat often came down to individual decisions made by pilots who had to choose between following orders and achieving mission success. She chose mission success. Kate began by implementing electronic warfare techniques that her father's unit had developed for disrupting enemy communications without alerting them to the source of interference. Using her F-35's advanced electronic systems in ways that weren't covered in standard training manuals, she created selective communication disruptions that prevented the opposing force units from coordinating their attack timing. The effect was subtle enough that the enemy commander would attribute it to natural terrain interference rather than deliberate jamming. While maintaining her disruption activities, Kate conducted precision mapping of the enemy positions, using sensor capabilities that exceeded her aircraft's supposed specifications. Her father's modifications had taught her how to optimize radar and optical systems for gathering intelligence that conventional reconnaissance methods would miss. She documented weapon placements, personnel concentrations, and tactical intentions with a level of detail that would allow American ground forces to counter the planned ambush. But the opposing force commander proved more adaptable than Kate had anticipated. When his communications started experiencing interference, he switched to backup systems and modified his tactical approach. Instead of a coordinated simultaneous assault, he began deploying his units for a series of sequential attacks that would be harder to predict and counter. Kate realized that her electronic warfare efforts had bought time but hadn't eliminated the threat. That was when Kate Morrison stopped being a reconnaissance pilot and became something her instructors had never imagined. She began systematically hunting the opposing force units using tactics that weren't taught in any flight manual she'd ever seen. Her father's log had documented approaches for using fighter aircraft in roles that blurred the lines between reconnaissance, electronic warfare, and direct action. Kate implemented those techniques with a precision that came from months of unconscious preparation and years of family tradition. Her first target was the opposing force communication center, positioned on a ridgeline where it could coordinate the entire flanking operation. Using her F-35 stealth capabilities in ways that pushed the aircraft beyond normal operational parameters, Kate approached the position from an angle that made detection nearly impossible. She couldn't use weapons against the simulated enemy positions, but she could use her aircraft sensors and electronic systems to create effects that would neutralize their capabilities. Kate positioned her aircraft directly above the communications center and activated electronic warfare systems that her father's notes had described as digital lightning strikes. The opposing force suddenly found their primary communications equipment experiencing failures that appeared random, but were actually precisely targeted disruptions. Radio systems developed interference patterns that made coordination impossible. Computer networks experienced delays and data corruption that rendered tactical planning software useless. The effect was devastating to enemy coordination capabilities, but Kate wasn't finished. She had identified 3 key weapon positions that anchored the opposing force's ambush plan, and she intended to neutralize each of them using techniques that would demonstrate capabilities far beyond standard reconnaissance operations. Her second target was a simulated surface-to-air missile position that posed a threat to other American aircraft in the exercise. Kate approached using flight patterns that her father had developed for operations in contested airspace, combinations of altitude changes, speed variations, and heading modifications that made her aircraft nearly impossible to track or target. She positioned her F-35 directly over the missile site and used sensor systems to create electronic effects that simulated successful missile defense suppression. The opposing force operators manning the simulated weapon systems suddenly found their equipment displaying error messages and targeting failures that appeared to be realistic equipment malfunctions. Kate had essentially killed the missile site without firing a shot, using electronic warfare techniques that were so sophisticated the enemy personnel didn't realize they were under attack. Her third target was the most challenging, a mobile command post that was coordinating the entire opposing force operation. The unit was positioned in terrain that provided natural protection from most forms of attack, and its personnel were experienced enough to recognize electronic warfare when they encountered it. Kate realized that conventional approaches wouldn't be effective against this target. She implemented a technique from her father's log that she'd never seen described in any official manual, using her aircraft's advanced sensors to create digital surveillance effects that gave her real-time intelligence on enemy activities, while simultaneously projecting false information to their systems. The result was that Kate could observe everything the opposing force was planning while making them believe their own intelligence was accurate, when it was actually compromised. Kate spent 20 minutes conducting what amounted to psychological warfare against the opposing force command post. She fed them false intelligence about American unit positions, created phantom radar contacts that suggested threats where none existed, and subtly modified their communications to create confusion about timing and coordination. The enemy commander found himself making tactical decisions based on information that was systematically corrupted, leading his units into positions where they would be vulnerable rather than advantageous. When Kate finally reported her activities to the operations center, the scope of what she'd accomplished left the exercise controllers stunned. In less than 2 hours, flying alone in a reconnaissance role, she had identified and neutralized a major enemy threat using techniques that none of the exercise planners had anticipated. The opposing force commander, when debriefed after the exercise, described his experience as fighting an enemy that could see everything and be everywhere at once. The immediate aftermath of Kate's actions transformed the entire dynamics of Operation Iron Eagle, American ground forces that had been walking into a complex ambush instead found themselves facing a disorganized and confused enemy force. The primary attack missions flown by Sullivan, Chun, and Hayes succeeded beyond all expectations because Kay had eliminated the threats that would have made their operations impossible. But the most significant reaction came from Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, who had been monitoring Kate's activities from the command center. As Kate's F-35 touched down at the temporary airfield in Colorado, Mitchell was waiting on the tarmac with an expression that combined amazement, confusion, and the dawning realization that everything she thought she knew about Catherine Morrison had been wrong. "Morrison," Mitchell said as Kate climbed down from her aircraft, "we need to talk. What you just did is impossible according to any training manual I've ever read. Those techniques you used, where did you learn them?" Kate looked at her instructor and realized that the moment of truth had finally arrived. The family secret she'd been carrying for years was about to be revealed, and with it, the understanding that Crash Course Kate had never been a struggling student trying to conform to expectations. She'd been an advanced operator whose capabilities had been constrained by training programs that didn't recognize what she was capable of achieving. "My father was Captain David Morrison, call sign Ghost Rider," Kate said quietly. "Navy Special Projects Squadron 19. His unit developed techniques for fighter aircraft employment that were never officially documented. He trained me from the age of 12 because he said the military would need pilots who could think beyond conventional parameters." Mitchell stared at her for a long moment, processing implications that went far beyond a single training exercise. "Squadron 19 was classified above my security clearance," she said finally. "I'd heard rumors about experimental programs, but I thought they were disbanded after the Cold War." Kate shook her head. "They evolved. My father's unit became something else, something that operates when conventional forces can't handle the mission requirements. He told me that someday the military would need pilots who could do impossible things with standard equipment." As other aircraft began landing and the successful completion of the first phase of Operation Iron Eagle became apparent, Kate Morrison stood on a Colorado airfield and watched her instructors and classmates begin to understand that their assumptions about her capabilities had been fundamentally wrong. The Crash Course Kate nickname was about to take on an entirely different meaning, and the final phases of Operation Iron Eagle would prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in a pilot's arsenal is the element of surprise. But Kate's revelation of her family background was only the beginning. The techniques she demonstrated were just a fraction of what her father's training had prepared her for, and the challenges ahead would require capabilities that would test the absolute limits of what a single pilot could accomplish with a fighter aircraft. The real test was yet to come, and 23 American lives would soon depend on everything Catherine Morrison had learned from a father whose military service existed in the shadows between official history and classified legend. The emergency klaxon shattered the pre-dawn quiet at 0347 hours. 3 days into Operation Iron Eagle, Kate Morrison bolted upright in her temporary quarters, instantly awake with the conditioned response of a pilot trained to react to crisis situations. The sound wasn't part of the scheduled exercise activities. It carried the urgent, sustained tone reserved for actual emergencies that transcended training scenarios. "Lieutenant," Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled over the base-wide communication system. "All pilots to the command center immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, all pilots to the command center for emergency briefing." Kate threw on her flight suit and sprinted across the compound alongside her classmates, noting the unusual activity around the communication center and the serious expressions on the faces of exercise controllers who should have been managing simulated combat operations. Something had gone catastrophically wrong, and the transition from training exercise to real-world crisis was happening faster than anyone had anticipated. The command center buzzed with controlled chaos as intelligence Analysts, communication specialists, and senior officers coordinated responses to a situation that was still developing. Large screens displayed satellite imagery, radio intercepts, and tactical overlays that painted a picture of disaster unfolding in real time. Kate recognized the terrain immediately. It was a valley system 30 miles northeast of their current position. While outside the designated Operation Iron Eagle training areas, Colonel Hartwell entered the briefing room with the grim expression of a commander facing his worst nightmare. Behind him walked a man Kate didn't recognize, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. The stranger's presence suggested that whatever was happening involved authorities and interests beyond the fighter weapons school. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hartwell began without preamble, "at 0315 hours this morning, a U.S. Army convoy transporting classified materials was ambushed by an unknown hostile force approximately 40 miles from our current location. 23. American soldiers are trapped in defensible positions, surrounded by enemies using sophisticated weapons and tactics that suggest professional military training." The briefing room fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of helicopter rotors warming up outside. Kate felt her stomach tighten as she processed the implications of what they were hearing. This wasn't a training scenario or simulated emergency. American soldiers were fighting for their lives against real enemies using actual weapons. The convoy was carrying prototype electronic warfare equipment that cannot be allowed to fall into enemy hands, the civilian continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone speaking for intelligence agencies that didn't officially exist. The ambush occurred in terrain that makes conventional rescue operations extremely difficult. Heavy ground forces would take hours to reach the position, and by then it may be too late. Hartwell activated a tactical display showing the ambush site in detail. The trapped convoy was positioned in a narrow canyon with steep walls that provided excellent defensive positions but limited escape routes. Enemy forces had established overlapping fields of fire that would make any ground approach suicidal, and the terrain features prevented traditional close air support missions from being effective. Satellite intelligence indicates approximately 60 hostile personnel with military-grade weapons, including surface-to-air missiles and electronic warfare systems, Hartwell continued. They've demonstrated capabilities that suggest extensive training and equipment that rivals our own special operations forces. This is not a group of insurgents or terrorists. These are professionals. Kate studied the tactical situation with a growing understanding of why the fighter weapons school pilots had been called to this briefing. The ambush site was located in mountainous terrain that would challenge even experienced combat pilots, and the enemy's electronic warfare capabilities would complicate any air support operations. Conventional approaches would likely result in additional casualties rather than successful rescue operations. The mission parameters are unlike anything you've trained for, the civilian explained. The enemy has established electronic warfare coverage that makes standard communication and navigation systems unreliable. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly, with cloud cover and precipitation that will limit visibility and sensor effectiveness. Most critically, the trapped convoy includes personnel whose survival is essential to national security interests. Major Chun raised her hand with the analytical precision that characterized her approach to complex problems. "Sir, what assets are currently available for rescue operations? Surely there are special operations units better equipped for this." "Type of mission," the civilian's expression darkened. "All available special operations aircraft are currently deployed in classified missions overseas. The nearest conventional rescue assets are at least 6 hours away, and weather conditions are expected to deteriorate to the point where helicopter operations will be impossible within 2 hours. You 6 pilots and your F-35s represent the only immediately available assets capable of reaching the ambush site in time to affect the outcome. Kate felt the familiar sensation of pieces falling into place as she analyzed the tactical situation. The ambush site's location, the enemy's capabilities, and the time constraints created a problem that conventional military responses couldn't solve. But her father's training had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario, situations where standard procedures were inadequate and creative solutions were the only path to mission success. "Captain," Sullivan voiced the question everyone was thinking. "Colonel, F-35s aren't designed for close air support in confined terrain against entrenched positions. The risk of civilian casualties and the limitations of our weapons systems make this mission extremely difficult with conventional tactics." Hartwell nodded grimly. "You're absolutely correct, Captain. Which is why this mission will require capabilities and techniques that go beyond standard training. We need pilots who can operate in environments where normal procedures don't apply." Kate realized that everything she'd experienced over the past weeks had been leading to this moment. The systematic undermining, the isolation, the pressure to conform to conventional expectations, all of it had been preparing her for a situation where conventional approaches would fail and unconventional thinking would be essential. "I'll take the mission," Kate said quietly, her voice cutting through the nervous murmur of discussion among the other pilots. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's expression showed a mixture of concern and dawning recognition that Kate Morrison might be exactly what this impossible situation required. "Morrison," Hartwell said carefully, "this isn't a volunteer mission. We're assigning the entire flight group to support operations, with specific roles based on individual capabilities and experience." Kate stood up, her decision crystallizing. "With absolute clarity. Colonel, with respect, the other pilots are exceptional at executing standard procedures under normal conditions. But this situation requires techniques that aren't taught in conventional training programs. I've been preparing for this type of mission my entire life." The civilian studied Kate with sharp intelligence, clearly processing information that wasn't apparent to the others in the room. "Lieutenant Morrison, your performance during the reconnaissance mission 3 days ago demonstrated capabilities that exceed standard training parameters. Can you elaborate on your preparation for unconventional operations?" Kate took a breath and made the decision that would change everything. "My father was Captain David Morrison of Navy Special Projects, Squadron 19. He trained me from childhood in techniques for fighter aircraft, employment that were developed for situations exactly like this one. I can operate effectively in electronic warfare environments, conduct precision operations in confined terrain, and achieve mission objectives that conventional tactics can't accomplish." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Squadron 19 was legendary among military aviation circles, a unit whose existence was acknowledged, but whose operations remained classified decades after the fact. The implications of Kate's family connection reframed everything they thought they knew about her capabilities and explained the unconventional methods that had earned her the Crash Course Kate nickname. Hartwell exchanged a meaningful look with the civilian before turning back to Kate. "Lieutenant Morrison, are you stating that you can successfully conduct a rescue operation in terrain and conditions that would challenge even special operations aircraft?" "Yes, sir," Kate replied without hesitation. "But I'll need operational autonomy to implement techniques that aren't covered in standard procedures. And I'll need the other pilots to understand that this mission will require approaches they haven't been trained for." The civilian stepped forward with the authority of someone making decisions that would have far-reaching consequences. "Lieutenant Morrison will lead the rescue operation with full tactical autonomy. The other pilots will provide support as directed. Colonel Hartwell, prepare all 6 aircraft for immediate deployment." As the briefing broke up and pilots rushed to prepare for what would be the most challenging mission of their careers, Kate felt the weight of 23 lives settling on her shoulders. Everything her father had taught her, every unconventional technique she'd developed, every moment of preparation was about to be tested in conditions where failure meant death for American soldiers. But as she walked toward her F-35, Kate Morrison wasn't thinking about the magnitude of the challenge ahead. She was thinking about her father's most important lesson. When conventional approaches fail, the impossible becomes just another problem waiting for the right solution. The Crash Course Kate nickname was about to take on its truest meaning, and the skills that had made her seem like a liability were about to prove that sometimes the most unconventional pilot is exactly what the mission requires at the mountain. Weather was deteriorating rapidly as 6 F-35 Lightning E's prepared for takeoff, but Kate Morrison had never felt more ready for anything in her life. The ultimate test wasn't just beginning, it was exactly what she'd been born to face. 23 American soldiers were counting on her, and she wouldn't let them down. The engine spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder as Kate Morrison prepared to prove that innovation and adaptability weren't weaknesses to be corrected, they were weapons to be unleashed when everything else had failed. The real battle was about to begin, and the outcome would depend on capabilities that existed in the gap between official doctrine and battlefield reality. Kate strapped into her aircraft and began implementing her father's most advanced techniques, knowing that the next few hours would either vindicate everything she'd been trained to do or end her career in the most final way possible. But she'd stopped worrying about career implications weeks ago. Now there was only the mission, the mountain weather, and 23 lives that depended on her ability to do impossible things with a damaged fighter jet that was about to become the most important weapon in the sky. The F-35s lifted off into a sky that looked like it was plotting against them. Dense clouds pressed down on the mountain peaks, and visibility was deteriorating by the minute as storm systems converged over the Colorado Rockies. Kate Morrison led the formation of 6 aircraft through conditions that would have grounded most military flights, using navigation techniques her father had taught her for operating when conventional instruments became unreliable. The flight to the ambush site took 18 minutes through weather that tested every pilot's skill and nerve. Kate maintained radio communication with her wingman, while simultaneously monitoring enemy electronic warfare activities that were creating interference patterns across multiple frequency bands. The hostile forces had clearly anticipated air support and prepared countermeasures that would challenge even experienced combat pilots. "Storm lead, this is Storm 2. Captain Sullivan's voice crackled through the interference. "Electronic countermeasures are affecting navigation systems. Requesting guidance on approach vectors." Kate adjusted her communication systems using modifications her father had developed for contested electromagnetic environments. "Storm flight, switch to backup navigation and follow my lead. Enemy jamming is strongest from the northwest quadrant, indicating primary electronic warfare positions. Maintain formation spacing and prepare for unconventional attack approaches." As they approached the ambush site, Kate's advanced sensor systems painted a picture that was both worse and more complicated than the intelligence briefings had indicated. The trapped Army convoy was positioned in a canyon that offered excellent defensive positions but was surrounded by enemy forces that had clearly been planning this operation for weeks. Weapon emplacements, communication positions, and supply points were distributed throughout the terrain with professional precision. But what concerned Kate most was the evidence of heavy weapons that hadn't been mentioned in the initial briefing. Her thermal imaging detected multiple surface-to-air missile systems and what appeared to be man-portable radar units positioned to create overlapping coverage throughout the valley. Any conventional close air support approach would be detected and engaged by weapon systems that could destroy an F-35 before it could deliver effective fire. "Storm lead to command," Kate transmitted on the secure frequency. "Target area assessment complete. Enemy capabilities exceed initial intelligence estimates. requesting permission to implement unconventional engagement protocols. The response came from the civilian who had briefed them hours earlier. Storm Lead, you have full tactical autonomy. Mission success is your only constraint. Kate felt the familiar surge of focus that came when preparation met opportunity. Everything her father had taught her about operating in impossible situations was about to be tested under conditions that would prove whether his techniques were theoretical concepts or practical solutions to real-world problems. Her first priority was neutralizing the electronic warfare systems that were preventing effective communication between the trapped soldiers and potential rescue forces. Kate positioned her F-35 above the primary jamming site and implemented what her father had called digital surgery, precisely targeted electronic attacks that could disable specific systems without affecting others in the same area. Sensor capabilities that pushed her aircraft beyond manufacturer specifications. Kate identified the exact frequency ranges and transmission patterns the enemy was using for their jamming operations. She then configured her own electronic warfare systems to create interference that would cancel out the enemy's signals without alerting them to the source of the disruption. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Suddenly, the trapped army convoy could communicate clearly with the command center, and their reports painted a picture of a desperate situation that was rapidly becoming untenable. They had casualties, limited ammunition, and enemy forces that were preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm their defensive positions. "Command, this is Alpha 6, came the voice of the convoy commander, clear for the first time since the ambush began. "We have 4 KIA, 12 wounded, and ammunition for maybe 30 minutes of sustained combat. Enemy forces are massing for what looks like a coordinated assault from 3 directions. We need immediate support or extraction." Kate processed the tactical situation with speed that surprised even her. The enemy's positioning and timing suggested they were operating under strict time constraints, probably trying to complete their mission before reinforcements could arrive. Their assault preparations indicated they planned to overwhelm the American positions through superior numbers and firepower rather than patience and siege tactics. "Storm 2 through Storm 6, this is Storm Lead," Kate transmitted to her flight. "Primary mission is neutralizing enemy assault capabilities before they can overrun friendly positions. Secondary mission is creating extraction opportunities for wounded personnel. Each aircraft will engage specific target sets using coordinated timing." What followed was the most complex aerial operation any of the pilots had ever attempted. Kate assigned each F-35 specific targets based on their pilot strengths and the tactical requirements of the situation. Sullivan would handle precision strikes against enemy weapon emplacements. Chun would coordinate electronic warfare support to maintain communication capabilities. Hayes would manage logistics and ammunition conservation to sustain operations over extended time periods. But the most dangerous assignments Kate kept for herself. Her first target was a surface-to-air missile battery positioned on a ridgeline that commanded the entire valley. The weapon system was protected by natural terrain features and positioned where conventional attack approaches would be detected long before weapons could be brought to bear. Kate implemented an approach technique that her father had developed for attacking defended positions in mountainous terrain. She brought her F-35 down to an altitude that was dangerously low for the terrain, using the mountain contours to mask her approach until she was directly above the target. The maneuver required flying through weather conditions that reduced visibility to near zero while maintaining precise positioning relative to terrain features that could destroy her aircraft if she miscalculated by even a few feet. The missile battery never detected her approach. Kate's first precision strike disabled the weapon system so completely that enemy personnel initially thought they were experiencing equipment malfunctions rather than coming under attack. By the time they realized what had happened, Kate was already engaging her second target, The pattern continued for 45 minutes as Kate systematically dismantled the enemy's tactical advantages using techniques that combined stealth, precision, and timing in ways that conventional air support doctrine didn't address. She eliminated communication centers, weapon positions, and command posts while simultaneously protecting her wingmen and coordinating their operations to maximize effectiveness. But the most challenging moment came when Kate's F-35 took damage that should have ended her participation in the mission. She was conducting a low-altitude pass to verify the destruction of an enemy command post when ground fire from a concealed position struck her aircraft. The impact wasn't immediately catastrophic, but it damaged hydraulic systems and affected flight control capabilities in ways that would make normal flight operations extremely difficult. Storm Lead, this is Storm 2. Sullivan's voice carried concern that was audible even through the radio static. Your aircraft is streaming fluid and showing visible damage to the port wing section. Recommend immediate withdrawal for emergency landing procedures. Kate ran diagnostics on her damaged systems and realized that her aircraft was operating on backup hydraulics and reduced flight control authority. Under normal circumstances, she would be required to abort the mission and attempt an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airfield. But the trapped soldiers were still under attack, and her withdrawal would leave them vulnerable to enemy forces that were regrouping for another assault. She made a decision that would become legendary among military aviators. Storm 2, Storm Lead continuing mission. Aircraft damage is manageable using emergency procedures. Kate began implementing techniques her father had developed for operating damaged aircraft in combat situations. Continue operations as planned. I'll provide close air support for final extraction operations. What followed was 15 minutes of flying that defied everything her instructors thought they knew about aircraft capabilities and pilot skills. Kate's damaged F-35 shouldn't have been able to maintain controlled flight, let alone conduct precision attacks in mountainous terrain during deteriorating weather conditions. But her father's training had prepared her for exactly this scenario. She used manual flight control techniques that compensated for hydraulic failures, navigation methods that didn't rely on damaged electronic systems, and weapons delivery approaches that accounted for reduced aircraft performance. Most importantly, she maintained a tactical initiative that kept enemy forces off balance and prevented them from organizing effective resistance. The breakthrough came when Kate identified the enemy commander's position and realized that a single, precisely timed attack could collapse their entire tactical organization. The target was positioned in terrain that made conventional weapons delivery impossible, protected by natural features that would defeat normal attack approaches. Kate implemented the most advanced technique her father had ever taught her, using a damaged aircraft as a precision weapons platform in conditions that would challenge even fully functional jets. She brought her crippled F-35 through a series of maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible with her aircraft's degraded flight control systems, positioning herself for a shot that required absolute precision in timing and weapons delivery. The strike was perfect. The enemy command structure collapsed, and their coordinated assault degenerated into confusion and retreat as individual units lost communication and leadership. Within minutes, the pressure on the trapped Army convoy diminished from overwhelming to manageable, and extraction operations became possible. "Command, this is Alpha 6. The convoy commander's voice carried exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "Enemy forces are withdrawing. Repeat, enemy forces are breaking contact and withdrawing from engagement areas. Request immediate medical evacuation for wounded personnel." Kate's damaged F-35 limped back toward base with hydraulic fluid streaming behind it and flight control systems operating on backup power. Her wingmen formed a protective formation around her aircraft, ready to assist if her damage became uncontrollable. But Kate maintained steady flight using techniques that none of her fellow pilots had ever seen demonstrated. The landing was a masterpiece of emergency aviation. Kate brought her damaged aircraft down on a runway that was barely long enough for normal F-35 operations, with weather conditions that were challenging even for fully functional jets. She touched down with precision that would have been impressive under normal circumstances and was extraordinary given her aircraft's condition. As her F-35 rolled to a stop, Kate Morrison sat in her cockpit for a moment, processing what she'd just accomplished. She'd led a complex air operation under extreme conditions, saved 23 American lives, and demonstrated capabilities that would fundamentally change how military aviation approached difficult missions. But more importantly, she'd proven that the unconventional methods that had earned her criticism were actually advanced techniques for solving problems that conventional approaches couldn't handle. The ground crew that surrounded her aircraft worked with efficient professionalism to secure the damaged jet and ensure Kate's safety. But their expressions showed the kind of respect reserved for pilots who had just accomplished something that would be discussed in aviation circles for decades. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell was waiting as Kate climbed down from her aircraft. Her instructor's face showed a combination of amazement, concern, and the dawning realization that everything she thought she knew about Catherine Morrison had been incomplete. "Morrison," Mitchell said, her voice carrying emotions that were difficult to identify, "what you just did. I've been flying for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. Those techniques you used, they're not in any manual I know." Kate looked at her instructor and realized that the relationship dynamic had fundamentally changed. She was no longer a struggling student trying to meet expectations that didn't match her capabilities. She was a combat-proven pilot whose skills had been validated under conditions that few aviators would ever face. "Ma'am, my father's training prepared me for situations where conventional approaches aren't adequate. Today was exactly the kind of mission," he said, "I might someday face." Captain Sullivan approached with an expression that was completely different from the dismissive superiority he'd shown throughout their training. "Morrison, I owe you an apology. We all do. What you accomplished today, ... You saved those soldiers' lives using skills that none of us possessed." The Crash Course Kate nickname, we had no idea what it really meant. Major Chun nodded in agreement, her analytical mind processing the implications of what she'd witnessed. "Your tactical decision-making under pressure, the electronic warfare techniques you employed, the way you maintained mission effectiveness. Even with aircraft damage, it's unlike anything covered in our training." Captain Hayes, whose dedication to procedures and regulations had often put him at odds with Kate's unconventional methods, looked at her with something approaching awe. "I spent weeks criticizing your approach to flying because it didn't match standard protocols. I didn't understand that you were operating at a level that went beyond standard protocols." Kate felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. The recognition she'd wanted for months was finally coming, but it had taken a life-or-death situation to prove that her different approach was actually an advanced approach. The Crash Course Kate nickname that had started as mockery was transforming into something that represented capabilities rather than criticism. "The mission isn't over yet," Kate reminded them, looking toward the command center where reports were still coming in about the rescue operation's aftermath. "We need to debrief, analyze what worked, and prepare for whatever comes next." But as the pilots walked toward the debriefing, Kate Morrison knew that everything had changed. The systematic undermining and isolation she'd experienced for months had been replaced by recognition and respect from people who now understood that her unconventional methods weren't weaknesses to be corrected, they were advanced techniques for accomplishing missions that conventional approaches couldn't handle. The fighter weapons school would never be the same. And neither would the military's understanding of what was possible when the right pilot was given the freedom to use capabilities that existed beyond the boundaries of standard training. Kate Morrison had proven that sometimes the most valuable weapon in a pilot's arsenal is the willingness to think differently when everything else has failed. The real test was over, but the legacy was just beginning, 6 months after operation. Iron Eagle, Captain Catherine Morrison stood in the classified briefing room at the Pentagon, surrounded by military officials whose names didn't appear on any public organizational charts. The room itself was unremarkable: standard government furniture, fluorescent lighting, and beige walls that gave no indication of the extraordinary decisions being made within its confines. But the people gathered around the conference table represented the most advanced thinking in American military aviation, and they were all there because of what had happened in a Colorado canyon when conventional approaches had failed. The man at the head of the table wore civilian clothes, but carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority that transcended traditional military hierarchies. General Patricia Hammond had introduced him only as Mr. Richardson from Special Activities Division, which told Kate everything she needed to know about the kind of operations they were discussing. "Captain Morrison," Richardson began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to discussing classified matters. "Your performance during the Colorado rescue operation has been analyzed by every relevant agency in the defense community. The techniques you employed, the tactical innovations you demonstrated, and the mission success you achieved under impossible conditions have raised questions about how we train pilots and what capabilities we're not developing," Kate had suspected. This meeting was coming ever since her promotion to captain had been fast-tracked through channels that bypassed normal advancement procedures. The debriefing process for the rescue mission had involved officials from organizations she'd never heard of, and the classification level assigned to her after-action reports indicated that her techniques were being studied at the highest levels of military intelligence. The rescue operation saved 23 lives and prevented the compromise of classified technology that would have set our electronic warfare capabilities back by years, General Hammond added, her expression serious but approving. "But more importantly, it demonstrated that we've been training pilots to execute predetermined solutions instead of developing their ability to create solutions when predetermined approaches fail." Richardson activated a presentation system that displayed mission footage Kate hadn't seen before. Multiple camera angles showed her damaged F-35, conducting operations that defied conventional understanding of aircraft capabilities and pilot limitations. The images were accompanied by technical analysis that broke down her flying techniques, tactical decisions, and innovation under pressure. "What you accomplished in Colorado wasn't just exceptional piloting," Richardson continued. "It was the practical application of advanced theoretical concepts that our research programs have been developing for years, but never successfully implemented in operational environments. Your father's Squadron 19 training gave you access to techniques that we've been trying to replicate through conventional instructional methods." Kate watched the mission footage with a mixture of pride and unease. Seeing her own actions from external perspectives made clear just how far outside normal operational parameters she'd been operating. The damaged aircraft maneuvers, the precision, weapons delivery in impossible conditions, and the coordination of complex tactical operations while managing multiple system failures, it all looked even more challenging from the outside than it had felt from the cockpit. "Captain Morrison," General Hammond said, leaning forward with obvious intensity, "we want to offer you command of a new program that would institutionalize the capabilities you demonstrated. Instead of treating your techniques as individual skills, we want to develop training programs that could produce pilots with similar capabilities." The offer hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Kate realized that everything she'd experienced, the systematic undermining at the fighter weapons school, the isolation and criticism, even the rescue mission itself, had been leading to this moment. The military establishment that had initially rejected her unconventional methods now wanted to build an entire program around them, What kind of program? Kate asked. Though she suspected she already knew the answer, Richardson smiled with the expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly that question. Advanced Combat Aviation Development. ACAD would be a classified training program for pilots who demonstrate exceptional adaptability and innovative thinking. Instead of training them to execute established procedures, we'd train them to develop new procedures when established ones prove inadequate. The implications were staggering. Kate was being offered the opportunity to create the kind of training program that could have saved her months of frustration and criticism if it had existed when she entered the fighter weapons school. More importantly, she could ensure that future pilots with unconventional abilities would be recognized as assets rather than liabilities. The program would be based at a classified facility in Nevada, General Hammond explained. You'd have access to experimental aircraft, advanced simulation systems, and training resources that don't exist anywhere else in the military. Most importantly, you'd have complete autonomy to develop training methods based on your father's techniques and your own innovations. Kate thought about the other pilots at the fighter weapons school who had initially dismissed her abilities, and how their perspectives had changed after witnessing what unconventional thinking could accomplish under pressure. Sullivan, Chun, and Hayes had all requested transfers to whatever program she might be assigned to, recognizing that their own careers would benefit from exposure to advanced techniques they'd never encountered in conventional training. There's more, Richardson added, producing a classified document that bore security markings Kate had never seen before. Intelligence indicates that potential adversaries are developing asymmetric warfare capabilities that could neutralize many of our conventional military advantages. We need pilots who can operate effectively when our technological superiority is compromised or when standard tactics prove inadequate. The document contained threat assessments that painted a picture of future conflicts where American forces might face enemies with sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, advanced surface-to-air systems, and tactical innovations that could challenge traditional air power employment. The kind of missions Kate had trained for with her father, operating in contested environments with degraded communications and compromised equipment, were becoming increasingly relevant to national security planning. Captain Morrison, General Hammond said with obvious sincerity, you have the opportunity to fundamentally change how American military aviation approaches complex challenges. The techniques that made you seem like a problem student at the fighter weapons school could become the foundation for training the next generation of combat pilots. Kate made her decision with the same clarity that had guided her through the Colorado rescue mission. I accept the assignment, but I have conditions. Richardson nodded as if he'd expected this response. Name them. First, I want my former classmates from the fighter weapons school assigned to the program as instructors. They've seen firsthand what these techniques can accomplish, and they understand both conventional methods and advanced applications. Kate paused, organizing her thoughts with the precision that characterized her approach to complex problems. Second, I want access to my father's complete service records and any documentation of Squadron 19 operations that might contain additional techniques or insights. Agreed on both counts, General Hammond replied without hesitation. Squadron 19's records have been declassified for your access, and your former classmates have already expressed interest in joining the program. Kate continued with increasing confidence. Third, I want the program to include psychological preparation for operating outside conventional parameters. Many pilots have the technical skills for advanced operations, but they've been trained to doubt their own judgment when it conflicts with established procedures. Richardson made notes on a secure tablet, clearly pleased with the direction of the conversation. That's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. What else? Finally, I want the program to maintain connections with operational units. Advanced training is only valuable if it translates to mission success in real-world situations. Instructors and students need regular exposure to actual tactical challenges, not just simulated scenarios. The meeting continued for 2 hours as they discussed program structure, resource allocation, and the selection criteria for identifying pilots with the potential for advanced training. Kate found herself designing the kind of educational experience she'd always wanted, one that valued innovation over conformity, adaptation over rigid adherence to procedures, and results over process. As the official meeting concluded, Richardson approached Kate with an expression that combined respect and curiosity. "Captain Morrison, can I ask you a personal question? When you were going through the fighter weapons school and facing all that criticism, did you ever doubt that your approach was correct?" Kate considered the question carefully before responding. "Every day, sir. The hardest part wasn't the technical challenges or even the isolation. It was wondering if everyone else was right, and I was just too stubborn to see it." "What changed your mind?" "The mission," Kate replied simply. "When those soldiers needed help and conventional approaches weren't working, all the criticism and self-doubt became irrelevant. Results matter more than opinions." General Hammond overheard the conversation and nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of mindset we need to institutionalize. Too many pilots are trained to seek approval rather than achieve objectives." 3 months later, Kate stood in a hangar at Groom Lake, Nevada, watching as 12 carefully selected pilots began the first class of the Advanced Combat Aviation Development Program. The students represented the best unconventional thinkers from military aviation programs around the world, pilots who had been criticized for creativity, questioned for innovation, and sometimes disciplined for achieving success through unapproved methods. Lieutenant Sarah Chen was among the first class, having requested transfer from her assignment as a fighter weapons school instructor. "Captain Morrison," she said as they watched the students conduct their initial aircraft familiarization, "6 months ago I thought your methods were unnecessarily complicated. Now I realize that conventional methods are inadequately simple." The training aircraft lined up in the hangar represented the cutting edge of military aviation technology. Modified F-35s with experimental avionics, prototype electronic warfare systems, and flight control modifications that expanded operational capabilities beyond standard specifications. Each aircraft was equipped with Kate's father's innovations, translated from Vietnam-era technology to modern applications. Captain Sullivan approached with a mission planning folder that contained scenarios no conventional training program would attempt. "Today's exercise involves multi-threat environments with degraded communications, compromised navigation systems, and time-critical objectives that require tactical improvisation," he explained. "6 months ago, I would have considered these scenarios unrealistic. After Colorado, I understand they're probably too conservative." Kate smiled as she watched her former classmates embrace teaching methods that emphasized problem-solving over procedure memorization. The same pilots who had once criticized her unconventional approaches were now developing innovative training techniques that pushed students beyond their comfort zones and forced them to think creatively under pressure. But the most significant development came during the program's 6th month, when intelligence reports indicated that hostile forces were employing tactics specifically designed to counter conventional American air power. Enemy commanders had studied American operational methods and developed countermeasures that could neutralize traditional close air support and interdiction missions. "Captain Morrison," Richardson said during a secure video conference, "we're receiving reports that suggest your training program isn't just valuable, it's becoming essential. Adversaries are developing capabilities that specifically exploit the limitations of conventional military aviation." The reports detailed encounters where American pilots using standard tactics had been ineffective against enemies employing advanced electronic warfare, unconventional positioning, and psychological operations designed to exploit predictable response patterns. But in every case where CAD-trained pilots had been available, mission success rates remained high despite enemy countermeasures. Kate realized that her father's prediction was coming true. The military environment was evolving toward scenarios where conventional approaches would be inadequate, and pilots trained in adaptive thinking would become increasingly valuable. The techniques that had made her seem like a liability during peacetime training were proving essential for success in contested, operational environments. 1 year after the Colorado rescue mission, Kate received a call that brought her career full circle. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, now assigned as liaison between the Fighter Weapons School and the ACAD program, had news that crystallized everything Kate had been working toward. "Captain Morrison," Mitchell said with obvious satisfaction, "I just finished reviewing the latest class of Fighter Weapons School graduates. For the first time in the program's history, we had 0 failures among students who had been pre-screened using your adaptive thinking assessment protocols." The assessment protocols Kate had developed identified pilots whose natural inclinations aligned with unconventional problem-solving approaches. Instead of trying to force creative thinkers into rigid procedural frameworks, the Fighter Weapons School was now channeling their abilities toward advanced applications that enhanced rather than constrained their natural capabilities. "More importantly," Mitchell continued, "the graduates are reporting higher confidence levels and better tactical decision-making under pressure. They're not just following procedures, they're understanding the principles behind the procedures and adapting them to specific situations." Kate felt a satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. The program she'd designed was producing pilots who could think independently while maintaining the discipline and precision that military aviation required. The false choice between creativity and conformity was being replaced by integration of both approaches. 2 years after Colorado, Captain Catherine Morrison was promoted to Major and given command of the ACAD program's expansion to international partners. Allied nations were requesting access to training methods that could prepare their pilots for increasingly complex threat environments. The techniques that had started with her grandfather's innovations evolved through her father's classified operations and crystallized during her own training struggles were becoming the foundation for advanced military aviation training worldwide. The Crash Course Kate nickname had taken on its final transformation. No longer a term of mockery or even grudging respect, it had become a symbol of the kind of thinking that military aviation needed to meet future challenges. Young pilots entering advanced training programs spoke of pulling a crash course Kate when they successfully solved problems through innovative approaches that conventional training hadn't addressed. Standing in her office at the ACAD facility, surrounded by mission reports from around the world documenting successful operations conducted by program graduates, Kate Morrison reflected on the journey that had brought her from isolation and criticism to recognition and impact. The systematic undermining she'd experienced at the Fighter Weapons School had been replaced by systematic support for developing capabilities that transcended traditional training limitations. But the most meaningful development wasn't professional. It was personal. Kate had received a letter from one of the soldiers whose life she'd saved during the Colorado rescue mission. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez had been among the wounded evacuated from the canyon, and his recovery had taken months of medical treatment and rehabilitation. "Major Morrison," his letter read, "I wanted you to know that my daughter starts flight training next month. She's heard the story of what you did for us in Colorado, and she wants to become the kind of pilot who can do impossible things when people need help. She says she wants to be like Crash Course Kate, someone who never gives up when others are counting on her." Kate folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer next to her father's flight log and the original anonymous note that had suggested she quit the Fighter Weapons School. The 3 documents represented the complete arc of her journey from doubted Outsider to recognized innovator whose influence would shape military aviation for generations. The morning sun streamed through her office window as Major Catherine Morrison prepared for another day of training pilots who would carry forward a legacy that began with her grandfather's innovations, evolved through her father's classified operations, and continued through her own determination to prove that different approaches weren't necessarily wrong approaches. They were often advanced approaches waiting for the right moment to prove their value. 20-3 soldiers were alive because she'd refused to accept limitations that others had tried to impose on her capabilities. Hundreds of pilots around the world were now trained in techniques that could save lives and complete missions that conventional methods couldn't accomplish. And somewhere, a young woman was beginning flight training with the inspiration to become someone who could do impossible things when the situation demanded them. The Crash Course Kate legacy was no longer about one pilot's struggle to prove herself. It had become a symbol of the kind of thinking that would define the future of military aviation: innovative, adaptive, and capable of achieving success when conventional approaches fell short. And it all started with a pilot who refused to accept that being different meant being wrong. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.